Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, I'm Hijrah, a student of English literature. In this video, I will review the material of History of English Literature course from the Old English period until the 18th century. So, the first period is Old English or Anglo-Saxon period. The term Anglo-Saxon is a relatively modern one. It refers to settlers from the German regions of Anjou and Saxony who made their way over to Britain after the fall of the Roman Empire around AD 410. The Anglo-Saxon settlers were effectively their own masters in a new land, and they did little to keep the legacy of the Romans alive. They replaced the Roman stone building with their own wooden ones and spoke their own language, which gave rise to the English spoken today. The Anglo-Saxons also broke their own religious beliefs, but the arrival of Saint Augustine in 597 converted most of the country to Christianity. The Anglo-Saxon period lasted for 600 years, from 410 to 1066, and in that time, Britain's political landscape underwent many changes. The history of Old English can be subdivided into prehistoric Old English around 450 to 650. For this period, Old English is mostly a reconstructed language, as no literary witnesses survive, with the exception of limited epigraphic evidence. Early Old English, around 650 to 900, the period of the oldest manuscript traditions, with authors such as Caedmon, Bede, Cynewulf, and Oldham. And then Late Old English, around 900 to 1170, the final stage of the language leading up to the Norman conquest of England and the subsequent transition to Early Middle English. Some of the most important surviving works of Old English literature are Beowulf, an epic poem, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of early English history, the Frank's Casket, an inscribed early whalebone artifact, and Caedmon's Hymn, a Christian religious poem. Caedmon is the best known and considered the father of Old English poetry. Medieval era. The medieval period is the time between 1066 and 1485. William of Normandy's triumph over King Harold at the Battle of Hastings marked dawn of a new era. The overthrow of the Saxon Kingdom of England was to transform the country to the Normans conquered, from how it was organized and governed to its language and customs. The timeline of medieval era. Norman conquest of England in 1066. At the Battle of Hastings, Duke William of Normandy defeats Harold Godwinson and establishes his rule over England. Magna Carta in 1215. A charter agreed to by King John of England and his rebellious barons. The document would come to be seen as the beginning of legal limits on the power of monarchs. Beginning of the 100 Years in 1337. The King of England and France began a war fought off and on that would last until 1453. Black Death from 1347 until 1351. It was one of the largest pandemics in human history. It crossed through Eurasia and killed as many as 200 million people. In 1386, Geoffrey Chaucer began writing the Canterbury Tales. In 1431, French heroine Joan of Arc is executed by England at the age of 19. The War of the Roses in 1471 until 1485. The War of the Roses were a series of civil wars which occurred between two rival families from the royal house of Plantagenet, the House of York, and the House of Lancaster. What was life like in the medieval era? Most people in medieval society lived in villages. There were few large towns. The majority of people were peasants who worked on the land. There was a clear hierarchy in medieval society, often called the feudal system. The king was at the top, followed by the nobility, which included lords and members of the clergy. Below the nobility were knights and then peasants. In the medieval period, there was no organized police force and most law enforcement was organized by local people. Some children went to school to learn to read and write, but most didn't. Schools were expensive and usually located in towns. Instead of formal schooling, many medieval children learned how to farm, grow food, and tend to animals. Some also learned a trade or perhaps become an apprentice to a local craft person like a carpenter or a tailor. Significant authors and works. Dante Alighieri, who wrote the Divine Comedy. Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of the Canterbury Tales. Geoffrey of Monmouth, the author of the History of the Kings of Britain. Margery Kempe, the author of the Book of Margery Kempe. Renaissance and Reformation. The Renaissance period in English literature is also called the Elizabethan period or the Age of Shakespeare. The new ideas of science, the arts, and philosophy, which emerged in the awakening of the Renaissance, encouraged English thinkers to consider much wider interaction with the rest of the world. John Dee was one of the key philosophers, and he encouraged Queen Elizabeth I and her ministers to venture out into the Atlantic and go west to the Americas for new lands and riches. The changes in the Christian Church in the Reformation of the 16th century affected England dramatically. After a struggle of several decades, England emerged as a Protestant nation under Queen Elizabeth I after 1558. This meant that English security was going to be threatened by the major Catholic countries of Europe, mainly Spain and France. Timeline of period 1558, Queen Elizabeth I is crowned. 1563, Martin Luther's 31 articles are published. 1569, Northern England rebels on behalf of Mary Queen of Scots. 1570, the Catholic Church excommunicates Queen Elizabeth I. 1576, the Curtin Theatre is built. 1585 until 1604, England is at war with Spain. 1586, the Babington plot to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I and place Mary Queen of Scots on the throne is discovered. 1593, the theaters are closed due to plague. 1594, the theaters reopen and the first recorded performance of Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus take place. 1603, Queen Elizabeth I dies and James VI of Scotland becomes King James I of England. 1642, the English Civil War commences and the Puritan Parliament bans the theatre and closes the playhouses. The characteristics of the period. In England, Renaissance kindled a kind of fire of knowledge that kept on burning for several centuries. It led the writers to classical learning that liberated them from religious control. The humanistic movement that started with it enhanced sensitiveness to the formal beauty and the cultivation of the aesthetic sense. Renaissance spirit was the willing force. Dynastic and political confusion come to an end. Religious conflict come to an end. Various types of inventions took place in this period. The writers started their writings without the intervention of the church. Scientific discoveries were traceable. The autocracy of the Pope was challenged by Martin Luther. Significant authors and works. Ben Jonson, the author of The Alchemist. Thomas Middleton, the author of The Roaring Girl. Thomas Dekker, the author of The Shoemaker's Holiday. Thomas Kidd, the author of The Spanish Tragedy. William Shakespeare, the author of Venus and Adonis. Christopher Marlowe, the author of Dr. Faustus. John Webster, the author of the Duchess of Malfi. Revolution and Restoration Era. The Revolution from 1640 until the 1660. In the 20th century, Marxist historians introduced the use of the term English Revolution to describe the period of the English Civil War and Commonwealth period, in which Parliament challenged King Charles I's authority, engaged in civil conflict against his forces, and executed him in 1649. The events of 1640 to 1660 in Britain were a bourgeois revolution in which the final section of English feudalism was destroyed by a bourgeois class and replaced with a state and society which reflected the wider establishment of agrarian capitalism. Such an analysis sees the English Revolution as pivotal in the transition from feudalism to capitalism and from feudal state to a capitalist state in Britain. The Restoration from 1660 until 1685. The restoration of the monarchy in England in 1660. It marked the return of Charles II as king from 1660 until 1685. The period, which also included the reign of James II from 1685 until 1688, was marked by an expansion in colonial trade, the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and a revival of drama and literature. The execution of Charles I shook up all European monarchs and the leading aristocracy. It was the first time in history that a ruling monarch was beheaded by a parliamentary institution, and it endangered not only the idea of the divine right of kings, but the idea of state and government on its whole. Therefore, when the English Parliament was called back to office, immediately after Cromwell's son's failure to rule, it was clear to all that it will be best for England's future political influence on an international basis to restore the monarchy and its legitimate heir to the throne. Charles II came back to England from his French exile in 1660. The monarchy was then restored. Significant authors and works. Samuel Butler, the author of Hudibras. John Locke, the author of An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travel. John Bunyan, the author of Pilgrim's Progress. The 18th century. The 18th century was characterized by numerous major wars, especially with France, with the growth and collapse of the First British Empire, with the origins of the Second British Empire, and with steady economic and social growth at home. Timeline of period. In 1702, Anne becomes queen succeeding William II. In 1704, Battle of Blenheim combined Dutch and English army defeats France in Bavaria. In 1707, the Kingdom of Great Britain is formed. England and Scotland become one country. In 1711, the first race meeting is held at Escout Racecourse. In 1712, the last execution for witchcraft is carried out. In 1714, Queen Anne dies. George I of Hanover succeeds her. In 1739, Britain declares war on Spain in the War of Jenkins' Ear. In 1746, the Battle of Culloden, the last battle to have taken place on British soil, is fought. In 1754, Parliament passes the Calendar Act introducing the Gregorian calendar, correcting the 11-day difference and making 1 January New Year's Day. 1756, British and French 7 Years' War begins. In 1760, George III succeeds his father George II. In 1768, the Royal Academy of Wars was founded. In 1793, Britain goes to war with France. Characteristics of the 18th century. There were two different lifestyles in 18th century England, that of the rich and that of the poor. With industrial revolution which started in the middle of the century, came new machinery that saved time and made some people very wealthy. The rich were getting richer and the poor poorer. The population was growing wildly. Cities were dirty, noisy, and overcrowded. London had about 600,000 people, around 1,700, and almost a million residents in 1,800. Their calendars included dinner parties, opera, and the theater. Many had inherited their great fortunes and never knew what it was to have to work, cook meals, or empty their own chamber pots. Fashion was important in upper society. Upper-class women wore stays, which were bodices with strips of whalebone and hooped petticoats under their dresses. Men wore knee-length breeches with stockings, waistcoats, and frock coats over linen shirts, as well as buckled shoes. Three-cornered hats were popular too, and wigs. Schools were not compulsory, but many upper-class boys attended school, and some girls from well-off families did too. Girls were educated more in accomplishments like embroidery and music than in academic subjects. For every 1,000 children born in early 18th century London, almost 500 died before they were 2, generally due to malnutrition, bad water, dirty food, and poor hygiene. Orphans roamed the streets because they didn't attend school. They had little chance of improving their situation. Significant authors and works. Jane Austen, the author of Pride and Prejudice. William Wordsworth, the author of I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. William Blake, the author of The Songs of Innocence and Experience, Samuel Johnson, the author of A Dictionary of the English Language. I think that's all of the review of history of English literature. Thank you for watching. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.